Hey, it's State of State. We got your Nittany Line update. It's a football discussion with Tom and Justin, so kick back and press play.
With former Penn State and NFL defensive back Justin King, I'm Tom Hannafin. This is State of State. Please like, comment, subscribe, rate us, and turn on notifications. Follow us on social media at State of State Pod. Comment on our YouTube channel. And if you haven't done so already, you can become a member of our YouTube channel. For just 99 cents a month, you can get all upcoming episodes of State of State, plus our entire members-only playlist, ad-free, commercial-free. Hit the join button on our homepage or follow the link in the description of this podcast. State of State is presented by BetOnline. BetOnline continues to be the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for online betting. Whether you're a seasoned fan or a first-time bettor, BetOnline is your ultimate game day companion. With the largest selection of odds on everything from the NBA to college basketball to the NHL and UFC, BetOnline continues to be your number one sports betting source. From every three-pointer to hat tricks, BetOnline has you covered with odds, stats, and more for every game, every play, and every win. State of State is presented by BetOnline. The game starts here. State of State is a proud supporter of Blue White Outfitters. Blue White Outfitters was created as a retail shop meant to highlight the confidence, competitiveness, and fearlessness of the elite athletes found throughout the history of Penn State University. Check out their Lockdown U and Lawn Boys merchandise today. All sales from Blue White Outfitters directly benefit Penn State student athletes. Also, official State of State merchandise is available now. Support the show and grab State of State t-shirts, hoodies, hats, and more. Visit www.bluewhiteoutfitters.com today. Joining me today on State of State, he is Ryan Roberts from AtoZ Sports, and we are talking about Penn State's wide receivers in 2025. What can Penn State expect from a relatively new look room? A lot of people returning, some new faces from the transfer portal, some new faces as a part of this 2025 class. But the big question Penn State fans are asking is, will the wide receivers be any better in 2025 than they were in 2024? So hopefully, Ryan, you can give us some insight on that from the outside looking in. Appreciate that as always. I think we have to start in the past with how this wide receiver core played in 2024. To your eyes, what did you see that were the pluses and minuses? I think the minuses, unfortunately, are obvious for Penn State fans.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't think they had anybody that was like a demanding presence in the wide receiver room, right? Like you had demanding presence at tight end, obviously with Tyler Warren, who put together one of the best tight end seasons I can remember in college football history. Like it was fantastic. Then you obviously had a couple great running backs. You had a good offensive line. Drew Aller is a really talented quarterback, but you didn't have a guy that I would say like in a high leverage situation, the football is going there. Like, and I could trust it to go there. You know, like Trey Wallace was a solid complementary weapon, right? Like Amari Evans had some speed, and I know those are both defections for the roster, but like they could have a role in an offense. But I don't think either player is necessarily a dude that like against Notre Dame, against some bigger, stronger corners, like they can win a one-on-one matchup consistently. So I just think that you need a more high leverage type of wide receiver in that room. I think you need a guy that is a demanding presence at time. And I don't think, unfortunately, either of the top two pass catchers at the wide receiver position anyway were that for Penn State last year.
To your point, Harrison Wallace III has transferred to Ole Miss. Amari Evans has transferred to Washington. It was interesting going into this past season is that there were a lot of hopes and dreams pinned on transfer from Ohio State, Julian Fleming. Boy, that didn't pan out. There was a lot of emphasis on Liam Clifford to be a reliable 3 or 4 wide receiver, depending on how you ranked him in the depth chart for Penn State. But Amari Evans produced limited catches, but limited ability within the route tree. Not saying that he can't run other things, but pretty much if it wasn't a go ball or a deep post route, it wasn't going to Amari Evans. Harrison Wallace was dependable, but didn't have that elite strength, speed, size to create separation. So first off, the departures of Wallace and Evans, were you surprised? And what do you think of their landing spots?
I was a little bit surprised just because I thought when you kind of saw what was coming back, right? Like when a Nicholas Singleton, a Katron Allen, a Drew Aller, like they all decide, I mean, even on the defensive side of the ball, like Dennis Sutton decides to come back. So like Penn State had a lot of dudes that were like, hey, we were kind of close this year. let's run it back and let's try to win a national championship, right? So I'm like, okay, it sounds like most of these guys are running it back. So I didn't expect the, two starting wide receivers would just be like, nope, we're good. We're out of here. Right. And I know there's a lot that goes into those conversations, right? Like,
Sure.
I mean, if you're James Franklin, if you're the coaching staff in general, like you have your exit meetings with these players too, where you just have to be like, hey, this is where we're at. And I don't know how those conversations went with an Evans or a Wallace, but overall I was a bit surprised because I'm like, okay, Drowlar, you saw the 2023 to 2024 uptick in production and consistency. Now, can we take that next step? It would be nice to obviously bring back those guys and then add to that room. But unfortunately, that was not a decision that was made. So I was a little surprised that they left, but I think obviously it makes a lot of sense as far as like not every loss is, I want to phrase this nicely, right? Like sometimes
subtraction.
yeah, addition by subtraction. Like sometimes losses are not necessarily a bad thing. I do think that there could have been a role for Harrison Wallace and a role for Namari Evans in the structure of an offense. But I do think that you went to the portal, obviously, with needs to hopefully upgrade the position. I think you potentially did do that if things work out the right way.
I was surprised more so by Evans. I felt like Wallace would have been a guy that stuck around too, but Evans to me had that burst, that pop that I was like, man, he can leap a few guys that are ahead of him right now in this wide receiver core in 2025. He could be the wide receiver number one for Penn State if he puts in the work in the offseason, develops a little bit more. Obviously, we'll never know how that pans out. So with Wallace and Evans departing, Penn State brings in from the transfer portal as virtual replacements for wide receiver 1 and 2, and that remains to be seen, USC wide receiver Kyron Hudson and Troy wide receiver Devonte Ross. So point blank, Penn State fans are asking, is Kyron Hudson a bona fide wide receiver number 1?
I think he's more of what you had. I mean, I think he's more of a wide receiver 1 than what you had last year. I think that it's so funny because I do think there's parallels between the losses and the additions, right? As far as like their roles in the offense. Like, I do think Kyron Hudson, is coming in to be Harrison Wallace's replacement as far as like his role in the offense, right? The number 1 receiver, and hopefully what we talked about in the beginning, a high leverage wide receiver, which I think he was last year at USC in a lot of points because they had like departmentalized players, right? Like Zechariah Branch was there for his speed, and you had a couple other talented players like Deuce Robinson who transferred from that team as well. That was more of your 6'6", long outside receiver, catch point type of guy. But I do feel like when USC needed a play, they looked to Kyron Hudson more often than not because he's kind of that 6'1", 205 physical type of dude. And I think that he is that guy that hopefully is that dude that when you need to move the chains, when you need a big play, when you're in a 2-minute drill where you need to score a touchdown, I do think that Kyron Hudson's a guy that can potentially be that go-to option potentially. So I think he's an upgrade for Shover Wallace. Is he a bona fide, like, is he going to go out there and have 80 catches for 1,000?
Right.
Like, I don't know if he'll have that, but if he's a guy that can have 60 grabs, 800 plus yards, but like their money down opportunities are there and he's able to capitalize on it, I think that that's a plus, obviously, for Penn State.
I don't know if you're going to see a proverbial 70, 80 catch, 1,000, 1,200 yard, somewhere in there, receiver for Penn State for a minute. And I think Tyler Warren was, first of all, a unicorn. And I've tweeted at you and Joe DeLeon about this in regards to his draft stock, but the sheer volume of things.
You need to get on Joe, by the way, man. He is working the Colston Loveland tight end trade. I'm like, Joe,
I was like, is he buddies with him? Like, I don't like, I like Colston Loveland's game, and he's probably going to have some better measurables than Warren, but like a guy who can throw, run, catch. To me, he's a Dallas Clark, Chris Cooley a little bit. Like he just do a lot. But anyway, the amount that Penn State has showcased the tight end, regardless of who's been the offensive coordinator the last 5 seasons, and you've had just a wealth of tight ends. Tyler Warren's out, so I don't expect Luke Reynolds and or Khalil Dinkins to necessarily go get over 100 catches and well over 1,000 yards receiving. I expect to see a drop off there, but I know what James Franklin likes to do. They freaking love their tight ends. They just brought in like half a dozen more tight ends. They already had this fleet of 5-star and 4-star tight ends that could start virtually anywhere in the country. So my concern, at least in the immediate for 2025, is no matter who steps up and is the number 1 wide receiver, I don't think you're going to see those classic numbers of a wide receiver being the number one receiving threat. I really feel like Penn State's going to make Luke Reynolds the showcase of the passing game. He has the ability. He has that. It worries me as an observer because tight ends won't kill you in space very often the way that an elite game-changing wide receiver can. So that's a concern that I have. But as you look at this offense under Andy Kotelnicki, do you feel like, yes, it's going to continue to be tight end focused, or it's like, hey, they need to be more wide receiver focused for 25?
I mean, I think they need to be a little bit more wide receiver focused because, like you said, that there is going to be a production drop off to some degree, right? Like, there's no, even if, and because I like Reynolds too. I remember actually grading him out of high school, and he was obviously a big time kid, like high 4-star, borderline 5-star by a couple of different platforms. Like he's legit. Like he's a very good football player, and I expect the sophomore breakout. But even if he breaks out, and Khalil Dinkins is a good part of that room as well. I mean, we're not talking about 100 plus catches and 1,200 yards between the two, most likely, right? We're talking about like maybe between the two, they have 60 catches and whatever yards that would be. And that would be good production. And there's nothing wrong with that at all, especially for a sophomore and Luke Reynolds being part of that equation. But I do think that in that instance, though, you're going to have to find that production from somewhere else, right? Like, is that more of Nicholas Singleton in the passing game that we saw this past year? Is that more of wide receivers being just a little bit more high volume as a room just in general? So I think it needs to be more wide receiver centric, because I also think that knowing that Luke Reynolds is not going to be Tyler Warren in 2025, it would be nice if he had a little bit more space to work from, right? And my biggest concern with Penn State is that things are going to get too condensed offensively, right? Like you're really good at running back. You're really good at tight end from a depth perspective. Well, teams know that. Defenses know that. So they're going to start playing to that, right? So they're going to start forcing everything to be a lot more condensed to the middle of the field. They're going to close passing windows a little bit more. They're going to have big loaded boxes against the run game. And that's going to hurt you overall, right? So I think you need to be more wide receiver centric in the sense of if there's more threat outside, you're going to be able to get rid of some of that trash. You're going to be rid of some of that traffic inside and make things easier for Nicholas Singleton, for Kyron Allen, for Luke Reynolds, for the tight end room in general. So I think it needs to be more wide receiver centric in the sense of improving spacing, because I think it was incredible to watch what Tyler Warren did last year, because I always thought, for me, Tom, it's like, can you imagine Tyler Warren with a bona fide wide receiver one around him as well, where it's just like he's getting more one-on-one matchups and more open areas and easier windows? Like he would have had even more production potentially, or been at least a more like just killer consistently from a game-to-game perspective. So I think it needs to be more wide receiver centric in the sense of it would help the other best parts of your offense potentially going into next season.
Khalil Dinkins, I expect to contribute more as a blocker, is still very capable as a receiver, but I think that's more Luke Reynolds' game to be the receiving tight end. Andrew Rapplier, highly touted tight end, was injured most of last season. Expect to have him back. He looked good in spring ball in the blue-white game for Penn State. Just need to learn the offense a little bit more. Joey Schlaffer at tight end, like there's depth there. And then the class that just came in at tight end is stupid. So it's like, all right, you got more guys. It feels like, in my opinion, I think it's a recruiting thing that obviously the program favors, that it doesn't necessarily facilitate your offense to be as explosive and wide open as it can be. But that's my 2 cents. So I want to get to the other transfer wide receiver, Devonte Ross from Troy. So the natural question to ask with him, does he make the leap from the Sun Belt to the Big Ten in terms of production and competition? What is your perception of Devonte Ross?
I think it's a tricky evaluation aspect of a wide receiver making that type of jump, especially when it's only a 1-year sample size, because obviously he's just going to be in Happy Valley for 1 year. And we've seen some good happen with that. We've seen some other players not be able to figure it out and get their footing in just a year perspective, because like he's not going to be there long, right? Like he's not even going to be there a full calendar year. Like it's just not how it's going to work. So sometimes it gets very tricky in that conversation. But I do think that when we're talking about making that jump, if a player has a elite traits or a go-to trait that can be focused on and honed in on, I do think that makes that jump a little bit easier. And I think Devonte Ross has that in the sense of the kid can run and the kid's really good in space. And honestly, like, I don't need Devonte Ross if I'm Penn State to come in and again have 80 catches, 1,000 yards. I need him to be what Amari Evans was, but hopefully at a little bit of a higher volume. Like, can I get 40 receptions for 700, 800 yards from Devonte Ross as my guy that can create some explosive plays? Because we saw that at Troy. I mean, he was utilized vertically. He was utilized after the catch. I mean, he was even a threat as a return man as well last year. So I think that his speed and his explosiveness will translate well. I just think that if for Penn State fans out there, we need to understand what success can look like, right? Like, he does not have to be a perennial, like, he doesn't have to be a guy that is one of the top receivers in all of college football. He needs to be a better version of your speed threat that you had last year and be able to create some of that open space and take advantage of that open space. So I think he can. He was a guy that when he initially entered, I was very interested in, just for different possibilities of where he could end up, because I do think that athleticism can translate pretty easily to the G4 level. I just think it's about what the role is specifically that you're asking him to do, and then hopefully carving out that role to fit what he does really well, which I think is that ability to win in space.
Was teammates with Tez Johnson at Troy briefly. Tez Johnson, as many know, went off to Oregon in multiple years to develop in that offense and performed extremely well. Killed Penn State in the Big Ten championship game this past year. So that was firsthand experience. He's off to the National Football League. So I think there's people who naturally have compared the two. I think they're different. And also the one game that Devonte Ross performing this past season at a really high level was against Iowa, so Big Ten competition on the road at Kinnick, and he performed very well in that game. So a lot of people have been like, "Oh, he did that," so that means it's repeatable and sustainable at the Big Ten level. It's too early to tell. We have to see. I've heard people compare him to like kind of a Peter Warrick-esque. I don't want to necessarily compare them apple to apple in that respect, but Peter Warrick, former Florida State great, could do a little bit of everything in that department. Twitchy guy in space, that sort of thing. So not going to put him in that conversation, but TBD. So looking at the remainder of Penn State's wide receiver core, and granted some pieces coming in as a part of this 2025 recruiting class, and then there's the remaining guys that have been here for a while. It's looking at the Liam Cliffords, Tyseer Denmark, Caden Saunders, Anthony Ivey, Josiah Brown. There are others, but really I'm looking at that group of one. He has got to do something, because with Wallace and Evans departing, there is no guarantee Hudson and Ross duplicate exactly the production or the ability that those two guys had. You're still looking at the same group of guys and be like, do something. Come on. Like, so out of that group of guys that are returning, is there anybody that you're looking at and being like, this guy could jump?
Yeah, I mean, at my previous stop, I covered recruiting, and so a few of those guys are very familiar names to me, as far as like me just breaking down high school tape and seeing how they finish or how they project to the next level. And I like what I'm looking for, Tom, is again kind of going back to the initial conversation of like ability to spread the field. The easiest way to do that is speed and explosiveness, right? And the two guys that immediately come off in that wavelength or that profile is Tyseer Denmark's number one, who obviously I'm right here in South Jersey. He was a Philadelphia guy. Like, he's right over the bridge from me. I actually saw him in person once. I think when he was I think it was a sophomore, but it might've been when he was a junior, but they would just say, you are our best athlete. You're going to run Wildcat quarterback a lot. We're going to get you the ball in space, screen game, like just a bunch of different ways to get him the football. And I think that's what we're talking about, right? Like what makes Devonte Ross attractive is similar to what Tyseer Denmark makes him attractive. Now they're different types of athletes. They win in different ways, but the roles that they have are similar-ish as far as being space killers, right? And so Tyseer Denmark's one that is in the slots, screen game, RPO game, like just get him the ball fast and just let him try to do something with the ball in his hands. I mean, give him a jet, give him a reverse. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, he is that type of dude that's just really good with the ball in his hands. And the other one is Josiah Brown, who's out of the state of New York, that I know redshirted this past year. He, though, if you look at his high school background, he was a big time sprinter, especially indoors. Like, I think he was a 55 or 60 meter dude, and he had put up some great times. That dude's lightning. Now, he was a little raw coming out of high school as a wide receiver, because he looked more like a really good track guy that was good at football, but was still kind of figuring out the football game a little bit. But he has second gear. He has explosiveness to win down the field, and he has explosiveness to win after the catch as well. And I mean, you know the roster a little better than I do, but he might be the fastest receiver, at least just kind of looking at the roster perspective. Like, he's at least in the conversation, right? So if a Josiah Brown could just, I mean, what's a breakout for him, right? 10, 15 catches, but he does a lot with it, right? Like, he creates some explosive plays. Tyseer Denmark is a little bit more of a high volume slot guy that can make some things after the catch happen. Like, those are two guys of like the youngsters that I look at and I say, like, if those guys could take a step forward and Devonte Ross and Kyron Hudson just are as good as we think they are, and then maybe they're better than we think they are, then that's where your wide receiver room goes from below average or average at best in 2024 to an asset for you in 2025.
Yeah, Josiah Brown, I think there's that potential. The speed is certainly there. Anthony Ivy is another guy. Not to discredit Peter Gonzalez. He was a freshman who came in same time as Tyseer Denmark, suffered what was called a long-term injury over the summer. So he was a guy that was being talked about in the summer, as well as Denmark, as two guys that they're like, hey, they're not just happy to be here freshmen. They're freshmen that are like, we want to play this season. So does Penn State give them that opportunity in 2025? You got to see how Gonzalez's health progresses over the next year. Tyseer Denmark got some limited opportunities towards the back end of the season and flashed. To me, it feels very wide open because Liam Clifford didn't do enough last year to make you feel like, oh God, this guy's got to be our number 3 in terms of like dependability, reliability, familiarity. Yeah, maybe, but there are better athletes within this wide receiver room and then incoming freshmen who are potentially going to push that. So it feels like there's a better grade on this wide receiver room than it was maybe a couple of months ago. But to your eyes, on paper, is this exponentially better? And can Penn State really make it even better when the transfer portal window opens up again in a few months?
I think it is higher upside than what it had last year, which I think is what you were trying to find this offseason, right? Like Harrison Wallace, I think Harrison Wallace just kind of is what Harrison Wallace is. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? Like, I mean, he had over 700 yards last year, so he wasn't a bad player by any stretch.
No.
But was he going to come back and be a ton better? I mean, he was probably just going to be what Harrison Wallace was, which is fine, right? But I do think that unknowns can be scary on both sides, right? Unknowns are, I'm not comfortable 100% with what's going to happen, but I'm excited about what could happen, right? And I think that second part there, the latter, is really exciting because there's a world where Devonte Ross comes in and he's pretty much exactly what he was at Troy, where you're just like, that is an explosive dude who can do a lot for you with the ball in his hands. And then Kyron Hudson, if he's just a slight upgrade over Harrison Wallace, then that you improved your wide receiver room. You needed to improve the wide receiver room first and foremost. How much better it is, I think is question. But if you ask me today to project to 2025, do I think the wide receiver room is better than it was in 2024? I do. And if those young guys that we talked about, if they're able to take a step forward, then we're talking about it being potentially substantial, right? So I'm not ready to say it's substantial today. Right. I am ready to say that I think it's better, but I do think it is very dependent on how much steps forward those young guys take this offseason. Because I think ultimately, I don't think that the 2 transfer portal guys are the key to unlocking the potential of this offense. I think it's just them plus those young guys. Those young guys, I think, is what's going to make the difference of how much better this wide receiver room is next year.
I certainly hope so. And I think especially looking forward with the portal opening back up again, and hopefully that's the last time we have a spring portal. There's a lot of talk about that.
Yeah.
I don't feel like there's any game changers in the portal right now that you can go get, because it's going to be a lot of guys that are wide receiver number 2, 3, 4, 5 that after spring ball, whatever that looks like for Penn State, considering an extremely deep playoff run late in the calendar. What does that actually look like for Penn State? And then does somebody jump in the portal that really changes things? It's like the likelihood is no, because it just appears to my eyes, not sure what you've seen, is that people have figured out this NIL landscape and they're like, we know how to retain our players now, and we're not going to let someone like a Jeremiah Smith enter the transfer portal, or a Keon Coleman very recently is a good example of Michigan State, Florida State, and obviously shine for the Seminoles. So I just don't expect something earth-shattering at wide receiver to hop in the portal in a few months.
No, I think it's more likely that those things happen in the winter, obviously. Like after the season, that's when it happens. The spring portal is mostly, and I don't think this changes much. It's a weird landscape because now you have agents in these dudes' ears sometimes too that are like talking to them for months, like, hey, enter the portal, I can get you a lot of money. And I guess that could technically happen at any time. And there's obviously been some things where like contractual things fall through on sides of teams and players and all that type of stuff. So I guess anything's possible, but more than likely, I think the standard is going to be moving forward. Winter is where you get the talents enter the portal at a high level. And then the spring is where guys that didn't win a starting job enter the portal, right? They want a second chance. They want a new opportunity. They want a fresh background. So maybe that's a spot where if Penn State has a number that they still want to hit as far as like a volume perspective, like maybe a guy jumps in that didn't take the step forward. Maybe it's a guy that they're familiar with, like they recruited him. They're like, okay, come here. We'll take a shot with you. But you're not bringing in a guy that's going to come in and be your number one receiver in 2025. That's more of a depth, upside play, long-term type of thing. So I think this whole offseason, spring ball, just going into obviously the summer and everything, this is going to be about getting the best out of the room that you have right now, right? Like, let's get Josiah Brown ready to play. Let's get Taysir Denmark ready to do his thing. Let's get Ivy to get ready to do his thing as a complementary weapon to your older guys. So I think that should be the priority for Penn State. You have talent in that room. Beyond recruiting, the next step is development, right? So let's go develop our talents and then figure out where we need to bring in guys from a spotty perspective. But I think that it just deferring to the portal, to me, Tom, is just a very lazy way of saying that we're not recruiting well enough or we're not developing well enough. I think Penn State is recruiting well enough. They just need to now develop the talent they have, and hopefully it takes a step forward this year.
It feels very much like I'm looking at a Caden Saunders as well as a dude who's been injured a lot during his time at Penn State. And it's kind of like, when is this going to hit, if at all? And I think Penn State fans are really cautious now after the Julian Fleming, I'll call it a miss and a dud. I mean, basically was a blocking wide receiver this year. And I think 15 catches, maybe one score to my memory. Just that. And that was an evaluation that Penn State fell in love with 6 years ago when he was coming out of high school. And then they stuck to it. And it's just, okay, that didn't work. Just because he was at big brand name X, whatever, doesn't mean this is going to turn into something here. They've seen, Malik McClain transfers from Florida State, multiple years of eligibility. Bam, he's out, goes to Arizona State. Dante Cephas from Kent State. That didn't work out. Keandre Lambert-Smith leaves. Wallace, Evans, they leave. Like, it's just been this revolving door. And the hope is, can we please get a freaking wide receiver number one that at least resembles the days of Jahan Dotson, Chris Godwin? It's just been years since Penn State's had something like that.
It's the transfer portal era has just been so wild, Tom. Because I don't know if you feel this way, but like for me, it's like it's great for content, right? Like it's great for numbers,
it's great for
like
us.
all this. It's great for us, but from the fan perspective, right? Which like I covered Notre Dame for a while now on like that side. And like, I am a Notre Dame fan, like first and foremost, like my entire life. But so like from a business perspective, from a content creator perspective, it's great for business. But then also like on the fan side, I'm like, dang, man, like, can we like sustain this roster a little bit? Yeah. Like, can we develop this roster? Like, it kind of drives me crazy a little bit, but yeah, man, unfortunately, it's not going to slow down until some things are regulated a little better, right? Like, it's just never going to stop. So it's going to be a topsy-turvy world. It's going to be an ever-evolving world, I guess, to a degree. But more than anything, it's just constantly changing, to say the least. And it's going to continue to do so. So the portal is wild, wild times, man. And it doesn't seem like the Wild West is shutting down anytime soon.
Nope. We'll wait and see, as we say often on this show. He is Ryan Roberts. Check out all of his social media content. His content on college football is awesome. At Rise and Draft, works for AtoZ Sports. Ryan, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it. Thank you all so much for joining us. This episode and our entire library of shows is available now on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever else you get your podcasts. Please like, comment, subscribe, rate us, and turn on notifications. Follow us on social media at State of State Pod. Comment on our YouTube channel. And if you haven't done so already, you can become a member of our YouTube channel. For just 99 cents a month, you can get all upcoming episodes of State of State, plus our entire members-only playlist, ad-free, commercial-free. Hit the join button on our homepage or follow the link in the description of this podcast. State of State is presented by Bet Online and by Blue White Outfitters.